One of the greatest learning tools available to us is imitation. If you ever watch a child at play, one of the most common things you see is how they imitate the actions of the people that surround them. In one of Joseph Campbell's series of audio lectures called The Celebration of Life, he speaks about the beings that surrounded our ancestors early in their development as a species. He calls them our neighbors. He says our first neighbors were the animals, primarily the ones we hunted. The way that we imitated our neighbors became what scholars today call rites. These rites included naming ourselves and our communities after the animals, dances, games, and other rituals that imitate them, and blood sacrifice to give back the life force of the animals to the Earth Mother so that they would return. The next neighbors we encountered as we migrated into tropical regions were the plants. The way the plants die, rot, and become the life force for the new generations of plants was imitated in rites like human sacrifice, where we give up and leave to rot one of our own to ensure the survival of all. Finally, we come to the neighbors that are the most important for us in our study of astrology, the stars. When our ancestors discovered agriculture, we had a sudden abundance of food that allowed our population to grow quite rapidly. The first farmers would have been sowing and reaping at general times, and this would have been enough at first. But as population grew, more efficient methods of farming would quickly become necessary. By the time the first city sprung up in ancient Mesopotamia, there was a need for precise measurements of the passage of time for the purpose of maximizing agricultural production. A unique class of people began to emerge in these cities, whose job it was to predict these times, and they did this by observing the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Almost immediately, they would have become aware of 5 unique stars that changed their positions relative to the rest of the fixed stars. As they tracked the progress of these 5 stars, they realized that their movements could be predicted in precise mathematical ways. This is the origin of the idea that there is a precise mathematical order to the universe. Using their measurements, these people created calendars that marked each year by the sun's movement, each season by the constellations that appeared in the sky, and divided the year into 12 segments based on the moon's phases. Every person living in the society would then have ordered their life based on this calendar. They would have imitated their neighbors, the sun and the moon. Then it was taken even farther, as the relative movements of the 5 drifting stars were added on top of this calendar to mark the passage of an age, or eon. Again, the people began to imitate these stars. As Joseph Campbell refers to in his lecture, when the stars marked the beginning of a new eon, kings and their entire courts are known to have willingly walked into their graves to make way for the new king, the new court, and the new age. Imitation is like a game. We pretend to be something we are not as a way to learn about it. Then what we learn becomes a part of who we are. As our ancestors imitated the stars, they learned a behavior that creates a correlation between the events of their lives and the movements of the heavenly bodies. The first astrologers were the people attempting to make sense of this phenomenon. They took their observations about human behavior, and the calendar their astronomer colleagues had created, and put them together to create a guide for predicting human behavior in the future. Across the world, from Mesoamerica to China, wherever civilization sprung up, so did astronomy and subsequently astrology. Many different specific rites and rituals appear in these civilizations and change over time, but the source of this behavior, life ordered by a calendar based on the heavens, did not, and this became deeply ingrained in the conscious mind of the people living in these societies. Simultaneously, the archetypes of the unconscious mind began to manifest in the myths of these civilizations, and the patterns of the stories also reflected the calendrical system. Once all of this combines into a single school, we have each of the unique systems of astrology that have survived the millennia until today. The school of astrology we will be focusing on is what's called Western astrology, and the tropical zodiac, and it's largely based on the writings of Ptolemy in his book Tetrabiblos. The Tetrabiblos is a compilation and consolidation of the somewhat scattered astrological teachings that had begun with the Babylonians, and been transferred to the Egyptians by the Persians when they conquered Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then adopted by the Greeks after these regions were conquered by Alexander. The Babylonians were really the backbone of this school, as they invented most of the concepts in use today, such as the symbols, the association of the gods with those 5 moving stars, which today are called the planets, and the practice of mundane astrology, or astrology used to predict world events. When the Persians, and then later the Greeks, brought Babylonian astrology to Egypt, the Egyptian practice of decanic astrology combined to create horoscopic astrology. Decanic astrology was a system that measured the passing of time of a single day by the movement of 36 constellations through the sky. Because of the wobble of the Earth due to the gravity of the Moon and other bodies in the solar system, it appears that every 10 days a different constellation appears in the eastern sky before sunrise. Hence the name Decan, meaning one group of 10. When this was combined with the Babylonian system of dividing the year into 12 segments of about 30 days, 3 decans would be associated with each sign of the zodiac. Because of the fixation with whichever decan was on the eastern horizon at sunrise, the concept of the ascendant was born, and with it, the horoscope. Finally, the Greek obsession with mathematics gave birth to the aspects, or the mathematical relationships of each planet to the others at a given time. And after periods of falling in and out of favor in the Roman Empire, eventually, Ptolemy compiled all this information into his Tetrabiblos. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Tetrabiblos and other Greco-Roman writings on astrology were translated and preserved by the Arabs, who transferred Latin copies of them back to Europe through Spain starting in the 10th century, where they became very popular and were a part of almost all scholarly practices, including medicine, theology, literature, and alchemy for the duration of the Middle Ages. Astrology remained popular in Europe through much of the Renaissance, until the geocentric model for the universe came under criticism from scholars like Copernicus and Galileo. By the time of the Enlightenment in Europe, astrology was regarded purely nostalgically by scientists and other scholars.
For much of human history, only religious and sometimes political institutions had access to education. This means that the methods of thought were influenced and regulated by these institutions. When the hypocrisy and decadence of the religious institutions in the West became apparent to us, we made a collective decision not to rely on their authority as a source of truth, but instead to seek the truths we could know for ourselves by the presence of objective, empirical evidence. This is why astrology fell out of favor during the Enlightenment, but its reemergence in popularity since the 1960s, and the other ideas that emerged and have become popular at the same time, should tell us something else about ourselves. For some, the wonders of the universe that have been revealed by the scientific discoveries of the past 300 years have been a revelation akin to a spiritual experience. But for others, it has created a universe of bleak emptiness that fosters depressive, nihilistic, and defeatist mentalities. It is an important part of our individual and collective growth to face that nothingness and to learn to accept it. But to stare into the void endlessly leads us nowhere. And the next step in growth is finding our own personal truths that create the spark of light for us to follow through the emptiness. For many, astrology is a light, but we would be unwise to let ourselves be guided blindly by the authorities and institutions of astrology already in place. We should instead imitate our neighbors, the scientists, by adopting their approach of skeptical investigation. And perhaps we will learn something new to inspire and enlighten us.